Imagine standing in the middle of nowhere, buried under 20 feet of snow, with no food, no help coming, and the frozen body of someone you once called a friend lying just a few feet away. Imagine the hunger so severe it stops feeling like hunger at all, it becomes something else entirely. Something primal, something that strips away every boundary you thought defined you as a human being. Imagine making a choice in that moment, a choice so unthinkable that it will follow your name into history forever. That is where we are going today. That is the story of the Donner Party, one of the most harrowing, heartbreaking, and deeply human disasters in the history of the American frontier. This is not just a story about cannibalism. Do not let anyone reduce it to that. This is a story about ambition, about the seductive power of a dream, about the catastrophic consequences of trusting the wrong voice at the wrong moment, and about what ordinary people, farmers, mothers, children, newlyweds, will endure when survival becomes the only thing left. This is a story about the American West as it truly was. Not a golden paradise waiting to be claimed, but a merciless, indifferent wilderness that did not care about your dreams or your family or your God. It begins, as so many American tragedies do, with hope. The year is 1846. The United States is electric with possibility. Newspapers are screaming about manifest destiny, the idea, almost theological in its certainty, that Americans are destined to stretch from one coast to the other. California is the promised land. Oregon is Eden. All you have to do is get there. All you have to do is go west. And tens of thousands of people believed it. They packed their wagons, sold their farms, kissed their neighbors goodbye, and joined the Great Migration along the Oregon-California Trail, one of the most audacious mass movements of people in human history. Among them was George Donner, a 62-year-old farmer from Springfield, Illinois. George was prosperous, well-liked, comfortable. He had a beautiful wife, Tamsin, a schoolteacher with sharp eyes and a sharper mind, who kept journals and painted watercolors and was raising 5 children between the two of them. By any measure, George Donner had nothing to prove. He had land, he had money, he had stability. And yet, like so many men of his era, he heard the siren call of California and could not resist. Something about the West promised more land, more freedom, more legacy. And so, in the spring of 1846, George Donner organized a wagon train and set out from Springfield. They were not alone, of course. They joined the great river of emigrants flowing out of Independence, Missouri, a river of canvas-covered wagons, lowing cattle, barking dogs, crying bobbies, and restless young men squinting at the horizon. Among those who eventually gathered under the informal leadership of the Donner family were the Reeds, James and Margaret Reed, and their 4 children, including young Virginia Reed, 12 years old, who would one day write a letter that would become one of the most famous pieces of frontier correspondence in American history. There were the Breens, an Irish Catholic family from Iowa, the Murphys, the Graveses, the Eddies, the Wolfingers. Dozens of families, dozens of individual souls, all bound for California with their lives packed into wagons no bigger than a modern moving truck. By the time this group formally constituted itself as a wagon company in late June of 1846, it numbered somewhere around 87 people. 87 souls heading west, and they were already behind schedule, already late, already making the first of a long chain of decisions that would seal their fate. Here is where the story pivots on a single, catastrophic mistake, the kind of mistake that looks reasonable in the moment and only reveals its full horror in hindsight. At Fort Bridger in present-day Wyoming, the emigrants encountered a letter. The letter was from a man named Lansford Hastings, and Hastings was the kind of man the 19th century produced in dangerous abundance. A self-promoter, a dreamer, a con artist wrapped in the language of vision. Hastings had written a guidebook, The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, in which he advertised a shortcut he called the Hastings Cutoff. This route, he claimed, would shave hundreds of miles off the journey by cutting south of the Great Salt Lake instead of following the established trail north. He promised it was faster. He promised it was safer. There was only one problem: Lansford Hastings had never actually led a wagon train through this route. He had traveled it on horseback. He had no idea what it would do to wagons. The Donner Party chose the cutoff. Other wagon companies, more cautious or more skeptical, declined and continued on the proven trail. The Donner Party, seduced by the promise of a shortcut, turned south, and almost immediately the landscape began to punish them for it. The Wasatch Mountains came first. The trail Hastings had sketched in his guidebook did not actually exist in any practical sense. The emigrants had to hack their way through dense forest and rugged terrain, cutting a road literally from scratch. Men swung axes for hours under a brutal summer sun. Women and children pushed wagons up slopes that should have been impassable. What Hastings had promised as a quick passage through the mountains took the Donner Party 16 brutal days. 16 days they did not have, 16 days that would haunt every decision that followed. Then came the Salt Lake Desert, 80 miles of baking blinding white, a hellscape of cracked salt flats stretching in every direction with no water and no shade. Hastings had told them to expect a 2-day crossing. It took 6, cattle died of thirst, wagons were abandoned. Families who had carried everything they owned across half a continent had to leave their possessions scattered in the white emptiness of the desert, shrinking their hopes with every chest and trunk they left behind. The psychological toll was immense. The physical toll was worse. They arrived at the other side of the desert exhausted, depleted, demoralized, and weeks behind schedule. They were now on the slopes of the Sierra Nevada, the great mountain range that stands as the final barrier between the western desert and the California coast. And it was late, dangerously, terrifyingly late. September was slipping into October. The mountains ahead of them rose to elevations where winter came early and stayed long. They needed to cross before the snows came. They pushed hard, they pushed their animals until some dropped dead. They pushed themselves past exhaustion, and they almost made it. Almost. On October 31, 1846, Halloween, though the date carries its own grim irony, the lead wagons of the Donner Party reached the eastern shore of a small alpine lake near what is now Truckee, California. The lake sat at an elevation of roughly 6,000 feet, nestled beneath the Sierra Nevada's highest peaks. The pass that would take them over the mountains and down to safety was just a few miles ahead. They were so close, and then the snow came. It came fast, and it came heavy, a Sierra Nevada snowstorm of extraordinary ferocity, the kind that the mountains occasionally unleash as if to remind the world who is in charge. In a matter of hours, the pass was buried. The trail disappeared. The wagons could not move. The animals, already weakened by months of hard travel, began to die. And the Donner Party, 87 people who had set out from Springfield and Independence with dreams of California, found themselves trapped. They built what shelters they could. Some used their wagon beds, others built crude cabins of logs and brush. A small group that included George Donner himself, who had suffered a nasty gash to his hand while repairing a wagon, was camped about 5 miles back from the lake at a place that would become known as Donner Camp. At the lake, the main party huddled in their makeshift shelters and looked up at the white walls of snow surrounding them, and tried not to think about what would happen if no help came. Help was not coming, not yet. The winter of 1846 to 1847 was one of the worst in Sierra Nevada history. Storm after storm hammered the mountains. The snow at the lake camp eventually reached 22 feet, not inches, feet, burying the cabins to their roofs and creating a white, silent world in which the trapped emigrants could do little but wait and starve. Their food supply had been inadequate from the start. Remember, they had left possessions behind in the desert, including food. Now in the cold, they rationed what little they had with desperate precision. Ox hides were boiled into a glue-like soup, leather straps were chewed, snow was melted for water, caloric intake dropped to starvation levels, children grew hollow-eyed and silent, the elderly began to fail first. People started dying. The first to go were the weakest, the elderly, those already sick, those whose bodies could not maintain heat without fuel. Bailey's Williams, a young man who had been sickly before the journey, died in mid-December. He was not the last. One by one, the members of the Donner Party began to succumb to cold and starvation. And the survivors were faced with a question that no human being should ever have to answer. What do you do with the dead when the living are dying? The answer, when it came not as a decision so much as a descent, a slow, terrible crossing of a line that everyone knew existed and no one wanted to acknowledge. The bodies of the dead, frozen in the snow, preserved by the very cold that was killing everyone else, contained calories, and calories meant survival. And survival was everything. The first confirmed instance of cannibalism among the Donner Party occurred in late December, at a place known as the Forlorn Hope. A group of 15 volunteers who had strapped on makeshift snowshoes and attempted to cross the mountains on foot to bring help from California. They were 10 men and 5 women, and they set out on December 16 with 6 days of rations and the desperate confidence of people who have no other option. They walked into the mountains as a blizzard descended. They walked until they could not walk. Men died one by one, and the survivors, starving and freezing and half-mad with desperation, did what they had to do. They consumed the flesh of those who had died, carefully avoiding, according to later accounts, eating anyone they were related to. They ate strangers, they ate friends, they kept walking. Of the 15 who set out, only 7 reached the California settlements, 2 men and all 5 women. The women's survival rate has fascinated historians ever since. Some attribute it to body fat ratios, others to psychological resilience, others to something harder to name. But they made it, and they brought word of the nightmare unfolding in the mountains. Back at the lake, the situation had become almost incomprehensible. The survivors were living in caves dug into the snow, the original cabins long since buried. They were eating hides, bones, anything that might contain a fragment of nourishment, and the dead lay frozen around them, waiting. At some point, and the exact timing is disputed, the exact sequence of events deliberately obscured by survivors who later gave conflicting accounts, the people at the lake camps began to do what the forlorn hope had done. They consumed the dead to survive. What is remarkable, and what historians and anthropologists have noted repeatedly, is the care with which the survivors managed this horror. Bodies were processed out of sight of family members. Children were kept ignorant of what they were eating for as long as possible. The flesh was boiled or roasted and presented without explanation. There was, it seems, a profound and deeply human effort to preserve some remnant of dignity, some membrane between civilization and the abyss, even in the midst of the abyss. These were not monsters. They were people, terrified, starving, desperate people, doing what human beings have done in extremis throughout history, in plane crashes and shipwrecks and sieges throughout every era of recorded time. Among the most heartbreaking accounts is that of the Reed family. James Reed, the patriarch, had been banished from the wagon train back in October after killing a man in a fight, a death that occurred in a moment of confusion and desperation, but which the group, already under enormous stress, could not forgive. Reed had ridden ahead to California alone, promising to send help back. While his wife Margaret and their 4 children, including young Virginia, huddled in the snow at the lake, James Reed was in California desperately trying to organize a rescue mission. He did not know if his family was alive. His family did not know if he was. Virginia Reed, 12 years old, kept a mental record of those months that she would later commit to paper. She watched people die. She watched her family deteriorate. She tasted things she would never describe in explicit detail but whose nature everyone who read her accounts understood. And she survived. She survived because she was young and because her mother was fierce and because, perhaps, the universe occasionally extends mercy in the middle of its cruelty. The first rescue party reached the lake on February 18, 1847, more than 3 months after the emigrants had been trapped. The rescuers, 7 men who had fought their way through the mountains on snowshoes, arrived to a scene they would never forget. Skeletal figures emerged from holes in the snow. Children who looked like old men and women, eyes too large for the faces that held them. The stench of death and illness and desperation hanging over everything like a fog. 23 people were dead by the time the first rescuers arrived. 48 were still alive, barely. Getting them out was not easy. The passes were treacherous. The snow was deep. The survivors were too weak to travel fast. It took 4 separate rescue parties operating through February and March of 1847 to extract the people from the mountains. Each rescue party faced its own harrowing journey. One, caught by a sudden storm while escorting survivors out of the mountains, lost 3 of the rescued emigrants to exposure during the rescue itself. Another arrived at Donner Camp to find a scene of such extreme horror: bodies partially consumed, skulls broken open for brains, a man named Louis Kesseberg sitting alone among the dead, that the rescuers were shaken to their cores and would speak of it in hushed, horrified tones for the rest of their lives. Louis Kesseberg became, in many ways, the villain of the Donner Party story, not necessarily because his crimes were worse than anyone else's, but because he was the last survivor at the lake, and because when the final rescue party reached him, he was found alone with the body of Tamsin Donner, George Donner's wife, who had refused to leave her dying husband and had perished with him. Kesseberg, who had himself been severely injured and could barely walk, was found in a state that the rescuers described as almost inhuman. He later said that he had been driven by starvation to consume Tamsin Donner after her death. He said her flesh was the finest he had ever tasted, a statement so inflammatory that it followed him the rest of his life, destroying his reputation, driving him to lawsuits and public condemnation, turning him into a monster in the public imagination. Whether he truly said it, whether it was accurate, whether the rescuers who reported it were themselves traumatized and unreliable narrators, these are questions historians still debate. But the image stuck. Kesseberg became the face of the horror, and a convenient one because his vilification allowed everyone else to be heroes. The final tally of the 87 people who had joined what became known as the Donner Party: 48 survived and 39 died. The dead included men and women and children. They died of cold, starvation, injury, and illness. Some of them were consumed by the living. None of them deserved what happened to them. The survivors returned to a world that both pitied and feared them. They were objects of fascination and revulsion, heroes and monsters depending on who was telling the story. Some, like Virginia Reed, went on to live long and full lives. Virginia eventually married and settled in California, the California she had nearly died trying to reach, and she raised children and grandchildren and lived to be 74 years old. Others never recovered. Some carried the psychological weight of those months in the snow for the rest of their days, refusing to speak of it, haunted by the choices they had made and the things they had seen and done. The lake where they were trapped was eventually renamed Donner Lake. The pass above it was named Donner Pass. The tragedy had burned itself so deeply into American memory that the landscape itself was marked by it, named for the suffering that had occurred there, as if the mountains were trying to remember what the people who had survived wanted to forget. But what does it mean? What are we supposed to take from this story, this nightmare wrapped in snow and human hunger? Some people look at the Donner Party and see a morality tale about hubris, about the danger of trusting shortcuts, of following charismatic frauds, of letting ambition outrun caution. And there is truth in that. Lansford Hastings and his fictional cutoff cost these people everything. The decision to follow his advice, made at a moment when other wagons were choosing the safer path, was the hinge on which the entire catastrophe turned. Some people look at it and see a story about the raw, animal nature beneath the surface of civilization, about how thin the membrane between order and chaos really is, how quickly the rules we live by dissolve when survival is at stake. And there is truth in that too. The Donner Party did what humans have done in extremis throughout history. They are not unique, they are not monsters, they are a mirror. Some people look at it and see something about America specifically, about the particular mythology of westward expansion, the way it seduced ordinary people into extraordinary danger with promises of paradise, the way it chewed up the innocent and the unlucky and left their bones in the snow while the survivors got to write the history. There is truth in that as well. But what strikes me most, what has always struck me most, is something simpler and more devastating than any of these grand interpretations. What strikes me is the ordinariness of the people involved. George and Tamsin Donner were not adventurers, they were a farmer and a schoolteacher. The Reed children were just kids, the Breens were just a family trying to find a better life. They were people exactly like the people watching this video right now, people who wanted something, who worked toward it, who made decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, and who were then consumed by consequences they could not have imagined. And that is what makes the Donner Party not just a historical curiosity but a genuine tragedy in the classical sense. It is a story about people who were not fundamentally different from us, caught in circumstances that revealed the full terrifying spectrum of what human beings are capable of, both the horror and the love, both the depravity and the tenderness, both the will to survive and the willingness to sacrifice. Tamsin Donner could have left, she could have gone with an earlier rescue party, could have saved herself. She chose to stay with her husband, knowing what it meant, knowing he was dying and that she would likely die with him. She stayed. A woman of fierce intelligence and deep feeling, she stayed in the snow with the man she loved and died there. That is not horror, that is something else entirely. Virginia Reed, 12 years old, wrote a letter to her cousin after reaching California, a letter that has become one of the most famous documents of the westward migration. In it, after describing the ordeal in terms deliberately vague about its worst details, she wrote a line that has echoed across more than a century and a half of American history. She wrote, "Remember, never take no cutoffs and hurry along as fast as you can." Simple advice, devastating in its simplicity. A 12-year-old girl who had survived something no human being should survive, distilling the entire catastrophe into a single sentence. Never take the shortcut. Never trust the man who promises the easy way. Never let the hunger for something better make you reckless with what you already have. The snow at Donner Lake is still deep in winter. The pass is still there, still steep, still cold. The interstate highway that now runs through it, Interstate 80, carrying cars and trucks from Reno to Sacramento in a matter of hours, crosses the same terrain that buried the Donner Party under 20 feet of snow in the winter of 1846. Drivers cross it in minutes, in warm cars with heated seats and navigation systems and snacks in the cup holder. They cross it without thinking. Why would they think about it? But somewhere under the winter snow, in the silence between the sound of passing trucks, there is something else. A memory, a ghost. The echo of 87 people who came this way before the highway, before the guardrails, before everything that makes the crossing easy. Who came this way with nothing but wagons and hope, and a bad map provided by a man who had never actually made the journey. Who paid the most terrible price imaginable for a dream that the landscape did not care about. They were real people, every single one of them was a real person. That is the thing history keeps asking us to remember and the thing we keep forgetting. Behind every body count, behind every statistic, behind every grim historical episode reduced to a sensational headline, there are real people. George Donner, who wanted more for his family. Tamsin Donner, who loved her husband enough to die with him. Virginia Reed, 12 years old and sharper than most adults, who survived and wrote it down and told us not to take shortcuts. The children who never made it out, whose names we barely remember, whose bones rested in the Sierra Nevada for years before anyone thought to look for them. 39 people died in the snow. Their deaths were not clean or heroic or meaningful in any conventional sense. They died starving, freezing in extremity, having their bodies consumed by the people who loved them. And the people who consumed them, those survivors, carried that knowledge for the rest of their lives in the quiet moments in the dark, where no one could see them carry it. The Donner Party is a story that has been told and retold for 180 years because it touches something we cannot look away from: the question of what we would do. What would you do in the snow with no food and no help and the frozen dead around you and the living still breathing beside you? We want to believe we would make the noble choice. We want to believe we would rather die than cross that line. But the people who crossed that line were also people who wanted to believe that. They were also people who had their limits and their dignity and their sense of who they were. And then the snow kept falling and the days kept passing and the line moved. That is the truth the Donner Party tells us. Not that humans are monsters, not that civilization is a lie, but that survival is a force more powerful than almost anything else, and that the people who found themselves in the grip of that force were not villains in a horror story. They were ordinary people in an extraordinary nightmare, doing what ordinary people do when the alternative is death. And they were hungry. God, they were so hungry. In ways that those of us sitting comfortably in warm houses, food in the refrigerator, the world at our fingertips cannot begin to imagine. Hungry in ways that hollow out not just the stomach but the mind, that reduce consciousness to a single, unrelenting signal: survive, survive, survive. The California they were heading for was real. The dream was real. The love they carried for each other, and there was love, enormous amounts of it, documented in the letters and journals and later accounts, that was real too. They were real, and the snow was real, and the hunger was real. And the choices they made in the depths of that terrible winter, in the shadow of the Sierra Nevada, buried under more snow than most of us will ever see in our lives, those were real choices made by real people in the most impossible circumstances imaginable. Remember the Donner Party, not as a horror story, not as a punchline, not as a sensational tale of cannibalism to be whispered about for shock value. Remember them as people. As 87 people who wanted something and set out to get it and were destroyed by a combination of bad advice, bad luck, and a winter that did not care. Remember Tamsin Donner, who stayed. Remember Virginia Reed, who survived and wrote it down. Remember the children whose names we barely know, who died in the snow before they had a chance to live. And the next time someone offers you a shortcut, a faster way, an easier path that nobody else seems to be taking, think of a 12-year-old girl, half frozen, half starved, writing a letter to her cousin from the promised land she almost didn't reach. Never take no cut-offs. Hurry along as fast as you can.